What's up, society? Here's Miguel Abdallah, and I'm starting another Contrasenso Comum, your channel of psychology and behavior.
Oh, okay.
Today, we have our podcast, where we discuss about a diverse of topics with an expert. And I have the pleasure to be here with Dr. Will Fleming, who had his master's and PhD in behavior analysis at the University of Nevada, Reno, and who is the founder of Orientationalism, the Molar extension of Interbehaviorism. Hey, Will, how's it going?
Great, Miguel. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. I'm looking forward for this conversation because, Will, we have other episodes of this channel where we discuss about interbehaviorism. We discuss how Cantor's interbehaviorism is different of the contemporary interbehaviorism developed by Professor Linda Hayes. We have other channel, other episodes discussing about Rebus field theory and how this is an extension of what Cantor said, but it's already different. So Rebus is different of Linda, that's different of Cantor. And now, as far as I understand, you're proposing Orientationalism, which is another variation of interbehaviorism that's different of Rebus, that's different of Linda, and that's different of Cantor. So just to start, what is Orientationalism?
Orientationalism tries to answer the question, is interbehaviorism formulated by Cantor and others, is it capable of describing molar level organization like matching or equilibrium, those kinds of phenomena? And I would say that in the formulation developed by Cantor and sensed by other people, it is not. I think that orientationalism adds necessary components to the philosophy of science in order to account for molar organization while being more or less true to the extent that anything can be true to Cantor's postulates and metapostulates. It preserves the non-causal orientation of Cantor while also attempting to account for molar organization like matching. In doing so, there are fundamental changes to the unit of analysis that Cantor proposed. Cantor sees psychological phenomena in terms of integrated fields comprising specific factors, but those factors do not include what I think are necessary to describe something like matching, specifically discontinuous patterns of what I call functional contacts. Functional contacts essentially replace stimulus response functions from a Cantorian point of view. They're different than when Rebus talks about functional contacts. They're not describing essentially contingencies, which is really at the heart of the difference between orientationalism and the field theory of Rebus. Rebus introduces contingencies. Contingencies from an orientational point of view are inherently causal in a way that I don't think embodies what Cantor was really trying to get at with his field theoretical orientation. There's a lot of points where Cantor describes his approach and field integration as a new canon of causation. I think that is a little bit murky in Cantor's writing because he was primarily concerned with taking out precedent causality from his analysis. But if you're really trying to take out all causality from his analysis and preserve what I think is really special about a Cantorian formulation of psychological events, then you can't include contingencies, or you can only include them in specific settings or domains. Orientationalism tries to do that. It tries to preserve the non-causal naturalism of Cantor's approach while looking at temporally extended patterns of behavior that are so well described by Bracklin, Baum, and others who take on a more molar approach while also introducing causality to the mix in a way that I don't think we need to.
I see. We discuss a bit or a lot about that in the first international conference of interbehaviorism. And I think one of the points that was a discussion is traditionally in behaviorism, the very beginning, we need to differentiate between constructs and events. So the events, what happens, construct, how we talked about those things. When you talk about the patterns, I keep thinking, I think that was the point of the discussion that we had in the conference. If we're talking about the patterns, which events are we talking about? Because as we were exemplifying, me recording this episode of these channels, you teaching your classes, if you understand that as this pattern of activities as an event, I can still use interbehavioral constructs, the Cantorian ones, to talk about these things. And we can use other philosophies to discuss about these things. So when you talk about patterns, are we talking about the constructs described in Molar approaches, or we're talking about an event, and why these events are not possible to be studied or are not well studied under a traditional interbehavioral perspective?
So I think there's some nuance here that's important. When I'm talking about patterns of functional context and saying that that's different than what Cantor is talking about, I am thinking about patterns, things, events, um, in terms of ways that we're cutting up experience. We are always creating ontologies from a pragmatic point of view. I'm not trying to make claims about the way the world really is or reality or anything like that. To me, situating patterns as a basic factor when describing a psychological event, um, that is an appreciation of what it means to pragmatically construct the way that we are cutting up what we are trying to talk about in order to talk about it in a way that leads to better prediction control, influence, pragmatic ideals, I guess. In doing so, I don't think that there is a way of capturing what I am trying to talk about using Cantor's constructs. Thus, the need for new constructs in order to describe experience. So, for example, I don't think that, like, when you are using stimulus response functions or the other factors of Cantor's integrated field, that it allows you to talk about within a particular period of time how an organism alternates regularly between participating in different patterns or organizations of stimulus response functions or functional contacts. That is absent because psychological events for Cantor are characterized by specific stimulus response functions, not the relations between them. So often that is accounted for somewhat in terms of like the history of interaction between an organism and its environment. There is a particular interactional history that leads up to a particular point. The stimulus response function that is actualized in the present moment is constantly changing as the field is reorganizing. Everything that has been reorganized as a part of that history up until that point. There, in that reorganization, you might be able to say that there are different patterns of stimulus response functions or functional contacts, but that is not the same as actually isolating them and relating them to each other in order to capture what Molarists would consider covariance or correlation between patterns of behavior, patterns of environmental events. Those types of functional relations, at best, are implied by history without actually specifying them. I think that in order to highlight those functional relations, which I think is at the core and the heart of what it means to actually talk about psychological events in the first place, they should be specific factors in the field. And once you like go down that rabbit hole of, all right, well, what happens when we introduce patterns or the organization of what Cantor might call stimulus response functions, but what I'm calling functional contacts, what happens is that you start realizing that their unit of analysis, I think, is not any specific stimulus response function or functional contact, or really even any single pattern of functional contacts or stimulus response functions. It's the set of those patterns in relation to one another. What do I mean by that? I mean, you can think about a psychological event as a uh, set of patterns that are interrelated with each other, that interact with each other um, in a certain way for a certain period of time based on your observation. What does that mean? That means that participation within those patterns is regular or consistent over time for at least that period of time. If there is a change in the event isn't participating in one pattern to the other, it's a change in relative time allocation between those patterns or the regularity by which those patterns actualize for an organism or even a set of organisms, which is really the other extension that we are making from a orientational perspective on interbehaviorism. Interbehaviorism really it is a philosophy for more than psychology, but is primarily one of psychology. Cantor worked on interbehavioral psychology, more so probably than anything else. And that really considers how an organism interacts with its environment. What orientationalism does is it extends the field so that we're not just looking at interactions of a particular organism and considering everything else its environment, but we're considering patterns that one or more organisms can participate in. When the focus shifts to an orientation, it's the patterns that are primary. And patterns can consist of functional contacts involving any number of organisms. So that opens up our field of analysis to what might be called social patterns or sociocultural patterns. And we can relate those patterns together where two or more organisms are participating in to patterns that only a single organism is participating in, to the extent that changes in any pattern affect, if you're going to use a causal term, or change with, if you're not going to use a causal term, other patterns that organisms participate in for a particular amount of time across an observation window.
So it's a variation in the unit how your philosophy is organized to discuss about these psychological or sociological events. And you were saying that this change it's guided by pragmatic reasons. You say that pragmatism is a foundation of presentationalism, and you think that would be a difference of interbehaviorism, or they will be both in the same logic.
The logic is somewhat distinct because the logic is inherently molar and it's more pragmatic than I think Cantor would have felt comfortable with. I can't speak for Cantor. Cantor wrote at length about his instrumental approach. A lot of people have categorized his approach as somewhat realist. I take a more pragmatic approach myself, and the orientational approach can be seen as a theoretical in the sense that you can derive um, selectionist positions from an orientational position. So, for example, when I'm talking about patterns of functional contacts, I'm recognizing those patterns as discontinuous. You're alternating between patterns of participation. I am sometimes participating in a pattern of eating where I'm eating. Sometimes I am talking in podcasts. I'm alternating my participation between those activities, those patterns of functional contacts that are discontinuous over time. I am not in control of that. I don't have agency over doing that, but my participation shifts between those patterns. In doing so, you could cut up those patterns in different ways. And you could cut up a discontinuous pattern that's constantly transforming in relation to other patterns into subpopulations, and then treat each episode of a pattern as if it was a member of that population in order to do a selectionist account of what it means to behave. You can do that. You can cut up a discontinuous pattern and do that, but you recognize that you are then cutting up a pattern in order to do a selectionist account, and you are also organizing those patterns in a particular way. You are often saying things like all patterns are sub patterns of surviving and reproducing. You're making claims about the organization of patterns in order to make sense of why organisms do what they do. But that's not necessarily the only way that you can think about why organisms do what they do, and an orientational framework that does not make theoretical assumptions of cause, allows for deriving different approaches, specifically like um, not only one type of selectionist approach, but there are multiple types of thinking about behavior, multiple ways of thinking about behavior from a selectionist point of view. So being able to find like a root way to relate them together by talking about how you might cut up a discontinuous pattern of functional contacts in order to get A, B, or C selectionist approach is helpful for relating them together. I think one of the undervalued facets of Cantor's work that I've been trying to preserve in an orientational framework is that interbehaviorism also leads to a philosophy of logic, not just a philosophy of interbehavioral psychology or behavior science. It's a way of understanding the activity of scientists, and I think that having essentially a meta framework by which you can plug in or use to describe many different approaches in behavior sciences is an asset of an orientational framework.
I see. When we discuss about this molar molecular distinction in behavioral psychology, we have a huge variety of ways to think about these constructs. I saw papers saying that Skinner was molar because Pavlov was molecular. Others will say that Skinner was molecular because Herrnstein was the molar one. Others will say that just Bounds and Racklin's behaviorisms would be the real molar ones. The other ones would be molecular. And I saw some approaches saying that molar molecular distinction would be more like a continuum, that you can see different features of these two in all types of behaviorism. So how you define molar, and at the same time, what do you mean by molecular, and how orientationalism would be molar, and the Cantorian or contemporary interbehaviorism would be molecular following these definitions?
So the molar molecular distinction takes a different form when you're talking like in relation to something like radical behaviorism to teleological behaviorism, or from interbehaviorism to orientationalism. And definitely there are many different views on what makes something more molar or more molecular, or whether it's discrete categories or whether it is a continuum. I tend to think that there are distinct logical categories that distinguish molecular versus molar approaches. I think Racklin argues this the best when he says that what really categorizes radical behaviorism essentially as a molecular philosophy of behavior is that it emphasizes the role that contiguity plays in reinforcement, whereas teleological behaviorism thinks about reinforcement essentially in terms of correlation between different patterns of behavior. I think that is the core. It's looking molecular contiguity, molar correlation, or covariance, which allows it to scale. Contiguity blocks scaling because it only lasts so long. There can only be so much time until something is non-contiguous anymore. So I think that that is a logical distinction that is not necessarily a part of a continuum. However, when it comes to the difference between interbehaviorism and orientationalism, you can have that scalability with Cantor's framework because the segmentation of a behavior stream is somewhat arbitrary. But what is not um, Moeller in his framework is an appreciation for discontinuous patterns of activity. There's a constant reorganization of factors, history being one of them, the actualizing stimulus response function being another. There's a constant change in what is being described as a psychological event is what is happening right now, the current reorganization of the integrated field. That is not accounting for regularity over time between stimulus response functions or functional contexts that can participate in those regular, discontinuous, albeit transforming patterns. That factor is just missing. And I think that factor is what is necessary in order to like take an integrated field and then to subject it to an analysis based on matching. If we want to be able to translate what we're doing from an interbehavioral point of view into what Molarists are talking about, at least the Molarisms of people who were taught by Herrnstein and can be Molar organizations that can be described by the matching law, that we need to do something like that in interbehaviorism. Thus, the precedent for orientationalism. I do understand that other people have different views on what it means for something to be molar, um, but for me, that's the heart of it.
So it's still possible to have you can still analyze those events, but you would analyze necessarily in a molecular way. You would always get these small, you break the pattern in smaller parts to get your unit of analysis, the psychological events in an interbehavioral perspective, and in the orientationalism, it wouldn't get. Which brings me the another question. You talked a bit about your unit of analysis, but I'd like us to discuss even more. What is the unit of analysis of orientationalism? And you're discussing that it's also for psychological events and for sociological events. So, where are we still talking about a psychological approach in these cases, or talking another field to use this unit? And what is the unit of analysis of orientationalism?
The basic unit of analysis in orientationalism is what I call an orientation, and it is a set of interrelated patterns of functional contacts. And in delimiting the subject matter that way, it does not preclude orientations that involve patterns of two or more organisms. So the limit of, hey, in psychology we're looking at the behavior of a organism, that is not something that is maintained in orientationalism, because if multiple organisms are participating in the same pattern, perhaps multiple organisms are working together to create products at a factory, we can call that production a pattern of functional context that two or more organisms are participating in. Those organisms are also participating in patterns where their coworkers are not a part of those patterns. So maybe they're eating, they're taking their money, they're going home, they're spending time with their families. There's a bunch of different organisms who are participating in A, B, C, X patterns, either together or alone. And the subject matter of an orientation can constitute all those patterns interrelated together. So in some ways that is not psychological, but in some ways maybe it's just a redefinition of what it means for something to be psychological. We're still looking at interactions that organisms are participating in. We're just not restricting it to the point of view of any particular organism or excluding other organisms' behavior because it's only relevant to the extent that it's a stimulus for a given organism. The shift towards patterns of functional context, which might be translated for some as patterns of behavior, they always include the behavior of other organisms if there are social patterns of behavior. I think it's restrictive to think that the behavior of other organisms is only relevant as stimulation for the organisms whose behavior is under examination or analysis. So I think that that is one of the biggest departures in an orientational analysis, is that it allows us to think like that. And to the extent that it does, I think it's progressive because um, it allows us to think about integrated fields of enormous scale, something that is hard maybe to capture in a laboratory, but allows us to think about social structure or social organization, um, organizations as a phenomenon, nations. It allows us to think at those scales without really having to come up with any new constructs in order for us to do so. There are important features of patterns that involve people interacting together in orientations, which we may call shared orientations to the extent that multiple people participate in them together and they're characterized by conventionality in which people talk to each other in a certain way, reference the world in a certain way um, with respect to one another. But ultimately, I think that there's the shift from an interbehavioral to an orientational point of view hinges largely on whether or not it's thought that behavior scales not only across space and time, but organisms themselves. Um, Billy Baum has a good line, I think, in a chapter in the book Contemporary Behaviorisms and Debate. I might be wrong about this, but he says that organisms are the medium of behavior. And when we start thinking about organisms as also the medium of social behavior or sociocultural behavior, then we think of also in terms of discontinuous patterns, then multiple organisms' behavior can be a part of a pattern. They're still, regardless if it's one or more organisms, those patterns are still made up of behavior. Not just the stimulation produced by other organisms as some kind of environment for a particular organism.
I see. In traditional behaviorisms, usually the question is what is social behavior? We have our unit of analysis, we have our subject matter focus in the individual behavior of that organism, and the social behavior is an extension of that that we need to understand properly. I was in the episode discussing about Ribes field theory. Uh, Jeff, who was the one discussing with me, who was saying that for Ribes, the individual behavior or what we do privately or behavior that we meet isolated is an extension of these biological and social behaviors. So we are integrated in the society, and those are the fields that we participate with. Is in this sense, because in the way that you describe, it's harder to me to think on a behavior that's not social, a pattern that doesn't participate with other organisms somehow. So the exception would be if we consider orientation of one organism isolated.
Yeah, to me, the orientation is also a somewhat theoretical gamble for the person doing the analysis. So I can do an orientational analysis where I'm only considering looking at one organism's behavior, one organism's participation in functional contacts with respect to the environment that in turn are um, parts of a pattern of functional contacts. I don't have to necessarily analyze the other interactions that other organisms are having. But this unit of analysis allows me to do that. And I think that Rebus is along the right train of thought where he's recognizing that in order to understand even sometimes interactions that a person is having by themselves without other people around, to think that that is not related to social circumstance at all is a little bit ridiculous, especially in particular cases. Um, but then the question becomes, how to best account for that and what kind of assumptions are you making when you're accounting for that, and how are you dividing up, at least from an orientational perspective, those patterns. That takes a different form, obviously, for Rebus. And I know a lot of these terms are similar, which is a little bit crazy because I think maybe they both essentially come from different readings of Cantor. Um, I was not familiar with Rebus so much when I was coming up with some of the terms that I use, and then he also uses for his theory of psychology and theory of behavior. But I think that understanding wider temporal social context essentially is necessary for understanding situations in which people are acting or interacting with their environment in particular ways, particularly referentially, which necessarily implies participation within a wider social environment.
Before we go to the similarities and difference between these and the Rebus work, I was still curious about one point of the unit of analysis. You were describing that this unit of analysis allowed for analysis of these super complex social events on how the society is organized, structurized, or political dynamic powers and this kind of things. And I was curious on how is this translation, because you said that these type of events are pretty hard to get in the lab. So you think that understanding the orientation or doing basic research on the orientation will guide us to better understand these more complex events, or talking about different things that need different methodologies?
I certainly think that there are methodological uh, differences between cultural or socio-cultural interpretive work and doing experimental work in the lab and generalizing that out to larger societal practices if we're thinking about them in terms of orientations. I think some of the things that are relevant to understanding um, cultural, sociocultural, social practices that you can't necessarily fit into a lab can be still studied there. And I have attempted to study in part um, some of those features. For example, in my dissertation, I studied what I called differential contacts with a circumstance. So, what does that entail? Differential contacts with a circumstance involve asymmetric pattern participations between two or more people, in which what one or a subset of those people who are participating can contact about the circumstance differs from the others in how they interact, what it means to participate in a particular pattern, essentially in terms of power. I think that looking at those situations in controlled lab settings is relevant for understanding how that might play out in the actual lives of people in more complex settings. Um, I've done that mainly with computer programs where two or more people sit at a computer and are able to interact in very restricted ways with respect to one another. Um, in different circumstances, especially in my master's thesis work, I I mainly looked at the formation of what you could call um, conventional patterns of referential functional contacts um, in a very rudimentary way. But there were some interesting things that I observed doing that work and am still doing as I am still observing as I'm doing that work, particularly in terms of what I've come to call linguistic dominance, which might be a relevant thing to consider in everyday life in complex social settings. What is linguistic dominance? Linguistic dominance refers to an observation I made doing experiments using term based matching to sample procedures. In those procedures, if we're going to talk about it in a more behavior analytic way, essentially what is happening is that somebody sees some kind of simple stimulus. They are then able to send another person what you might call a message using a comparison stimuli that they select. That is then shown to the other person, and then they're asked to select their own comparison stimulus, one of which matches the sample presented to the first person. You can also think about this as a Lewis Grim signaling game. It's a little bit different in terms of like how the experiment is conducted. It's more behavior analytically sensible. But one thing that happens in those kind of situations is that not always, but often, one person will consistently select the same stimuli in the presence of one another, while the other person does not. But then the other person eventually, their interactions shift to match the person who is responding consistently. Um, I refer to that as linguistic dominance because one person's responding adjusts to that of the other, so that both are responding ultimately in the same way, but not at the beginning, only one person is. And perhaps that takes different forms in different everyday situations where one person, their responding adjusts to that of another person. It's not that one person has more power than the other person. It's just a feature of how a particular pattern of functional context transforms over time. And when we start thinking about it in that way, rather than like the influence that one person bears over another person or something like that, I think it allows us to think about power in a more naturalistic, non causal way, which might be particularly helpful in um, removing blame or those kinds of notions from our analysis or thinking about power in a necessarily negative way or light.
But describing those makes sense. when you talk about language, I kind of see some similarities on the way to think about language in the sense of referential events and the referor, refers, and these positions, but it's not the same thing. It's still a variation. How you define language on a orientational perspective?
Language, from an orientational perspective, refers to conventional functional contexts that are seen across different patterns that interacting people participate in with respect to one another. It's the convention by which people interact in a shared orientation. It is not just a bunch of referee episodes that are taking place. It is a conventional, arbitrary way of responding that is built on shared history between multiple organisms interacting with respect to one another, and specifically humans interacting with one another. I don't think there's evidence of referential functional contexts which form the heart of a shared conventional orientation amongst non-human organisms. So there's those types of restrictions, but it's not in a Cantorian sense or even like a Skinner verbal behavior sense, cutting everything up into a stream of listener, speaker, or referee refer interactions. There are just referential functional contexts in which individuals, people, are responding to each other, stimulus, objects, of circumstance, um, in a linguistic way, as if objects were X or A, essentially has certain properties that are what Cantor might say attributed to those objects. But from an orientational perspective, we're just talking about responding as if they were something particular.
And just to clarify, to see if I'm understanding, by conventional, you mean that arbitrary patterns that you learned with other organisms.
Right. And they are shared across organisms to the extent that multiple organisms interact with each other in the same way, the same conventional, arbitrary, referential way with respect to one another. And that is there is a continuity of interaction between those organisms interacting with each other that helps delineate groups from one another. You have to be able to show a trace of interaction from one organism to another, maybe indirectly through interactions with other organisms, but that's what is a boundary condition to different groups. It's not necessarily just people who all respond in the same way. It's people who all respond in the same way given a particular history of interacting with each other, directly or indirectly through interactions with other people.
So the group is defined by these conventional ways that was learned by the auspicious of that same group.
Yeah, and in that way, it is very Cantorian because it's Cantor described cultural psychology in a similar vein.
You were saying before about some similarities with the work of Rebus, for example, using similar words like the functional contact. But in the very beginning of our conversation here, you were stressing that the way to think about contingencies would imply some causality, and that would be the main difference between your work and the work of Professor Rebus. At the same time, in our discussion, in our episode with the Rebus theory, I understood that in general, people that work with Rebus logic don't understand that the way he defines contingency implies causality. He's just talking about co-occurrence, which I think you don't agree. And considering this, what do you think is what are the distinctions that you see between orientationalism and the field theory of Professor Rebus?
I think at the heart of the difference between something that is causal and something that is not causal is if you are describing the occurrence of events in terms of one another or not. So in Rebus's framework with contingency fields, at the heart of that, there are different events that co-vary with one another, in my understanding of Rebus's work. contingencies describe relations between events. Some of his contingencies are specifically occurrence contingencies, some of them are functional contingencies, but all of them are contingencies with respect to events in one way or another. In an orientational framework, we don't have different events. There's still only one event that we're cutting up into different patterns of functional contacts. To say anything more than that would be to impose potentially causality in order to explain patterns in terms of covariance or correlation, which you can do, and which I think is extremely useful when you are doing experimental work or you're doing investigative work in some way, but it's not a necessary thing to do. You can talk about patterns changing together and alternation between patterns as essentially just change within an integrated field without saying that you're breaking it up into a bunch of events and then talking about them being correlated or covariant together. It's there aren't events stacked in any way. When I am participating in a particular pattern of functional contacts, um, everything that is not a functional contact constitutes part of the setting or circumstance that is changing with those functional contacts, which again are interactions between organisms and their environment, stimulating stimulus objects. So there's always change happening. If I am, talking to you right now and I move, my body has moved. My body is not the same thing as a functional contact. Neither is my body in relation to the room around me or relation to you. That is a part of the circumstance that is changing with functional contacts, not before or after them, to have the grounds for covariation or correlation in the way that I think is at the heart of what Rebus is talking about. And not just Rebus, but other people who take on a molar point of view. There are relations between events, and that is what is really different from the way that I'm talking about things. And that's what's maintained from Cantor's position, right? Cantor is talking about psychological events constantly transforming reorganizations of a field. We can talk about a series or segmentations of events, but it's like parts of an explosion, right? You can cut that up into different parts of the explosion, but it's still all the explosion. And an organism is constantly participating in a psychological event that we can cut up into specific psychological events if we want, but there's really just an evolution of a whole organism environment interaction that we're trying to capture. And when we're talking from an interbehavioral point of view, and what I'm trying to do with an orientational point of view is preserve that while also integrating discontinuous patterns of activity that organisms alternate participating in.
So to keep the metaphor of the explosion, to counter the explosion with these moments that explodes into orientationalism, you understand this explosion as more prolonged. You understand all of that, all the extension of the moment of the explosion, the all the destruction that the explosion causes, all of that as one event in itself.
Yeah, and to some extent, you could argue that Cantor's formulation gets you to the same space. Like you can think about the from the beginning of an organism's life to the end of an organism's life, at least at some point during, like psychological development while in utero to the end of its life. You can think about that as essentially one giant explosion and then cut that up into psychological events and do the analysis that Cantor was doing. My orientational perspective is that, but you're cutting up the stream in a different way to recognize that there are units within the analysis or factors that we call discontinuous patterns that are regular across time to the extent that an organism keeps participating in them. That it's not always something intrinsically new every single time. The what is happening right now is always unique, but eating is still eating if it's right now, or if it's a day from now, or if it's a year from now. what it means to participate in a pattern like eating transforms over time, and the relative participation within other patterns also transforms over time. Um, but we're trying to emphasize in orientationalism that we can do an analysis where we recognize that some things don't change. And that is one of the things that can persist or resume discontinuously across time. It's a particular pattern of functional context.
I don't know what you think about that, but I have this impression that, and I talked about that in the video on the first interbehavioral conference, that looks like that interbehaviorism is passing for a rebirth. It's happening again. Now you're a professor in the McNeese University, and you create the interbehavioral lab. We have way more discussions about interbehaviorism in relation with RFT because the work of Professor Dermot Pines Holmes. So interbehaviorism is more in the topic of the conversations in behavior analysis more than I ever saw, at least in the recent years that I've been studying this topic. And you're developing a new journal also. It's not just we have a new lab, we have new researchers interested in that, but apparently now we're having a new journal specific on interbehaviorism. What can you tell us about this new enterprise that's been developed?
Well, first, it's very exciting. Second, it's also very young. It came out of discussions from the first International Congress of Interbehaviorism, had a bunch of people come together in Lake Charles, Louisiana, at McNeese State University. We discussed steps moving forward from the Congress based on presentations that were given there and discussions. What should we do next to really nurture a science that I think we all really see utility in and want to thrive. So we one of the working groups that came out of that Congress was establishing a journal specifically for interbehavioral psychology, interbehaviorism, and related offshoots, domains, enterprises, and that is currently in the works. Um, haven't given it a name yet, but very exciting to start putting that together.
And I'm looking forward to see the outcomes and the products of all of that. Will, to finish, I'd like to do our stimulus response game. I will tell you two behaviorists, and you tell me what's your favorite. Can we do that?
I hope so.
John Watson and B.F. Skinner.
Skinner, Skinner, um, he has just a clarity to his writing and a forcefulness to his approach that really is it's admirable. Um, my very first job in behavior analysis was working in the Center for the History of Behavior Analysis, and I just scanned and read Skinner articles all day as a part of that job. And in doing so, I fell in love with what he was doing. Such a great approach. Watson, also very forceful writer, speaker, um, certainly very charismatic in a way that Skinner likely was if I had ever gotten the chance to meet them. But to me, it's Skinner all the way.
B.F. Skinner or Stephen Hayes?
You know, Stephen Hayes was a professor of mine at the University of Nevada, Reno, while I was a master's and doctoral student there, and I have a lot to thank him for. But like I know Skinner is an intellectual hero of his. I think Skinner is also an intellectual hero of mine, as is Steve. But I think I still would put Skinner at the top.
B.F. Skinner or Jacob Cantor?
Cantor changed my life when I read him. I had mostly been familiar with Skinner and derivative positions of Skinner's work, and reading Cantor was just like trying a new flavor of ice cream for the first time and not being able to look back. So I got to go with Cantor.
Now let's make it even harder. Jacob Cantor or your advisor, Linda Hayes?
Oh, that's a mean question, but um, I I don't think there is a behavior scientist that I have more respect for than Linda. So I will go with Linda.
Linda Hayes or Billy Baum?
oh, this is also unfair. I really love Billy's work so much. But I'm always going to be indebted to what Linda invested in me and what I have learned from her. I learned so much from Linda, so Linda is still at the top.
So Linda is our winner. Will, thanks so much for participating. To the ones who are watching us, consider to subscribe if you're not subscribed. Hit the like to help us to keep producing this type of content. And if you want to keep receiving this type of work, consider to turn on the bell of this channel. Will, thank you so much. I love this conversation. You know how much I'm in contact with your work. And tell us, how can we find you, and the final recommendations that you can have for our audience in here.
If you want to know more about my work, you can always email me at wfleming@mcneese.edu. That email might be put in the description for this video. I hope it is. There's also a website that my lab maintains, the Interbehavioral Research Lab. You can visit us at www.ibxrl.com. We put up our research and what we're doing and events there. So please make sure to check us out. We also put videos, so you might be able to find this and links to other videos that you're doing for your podcast there. We want to spread the word about just cool things that are happening in behavior science, and certainly this channel is doing that.
Thank you so much. That's what we have for today. Until next time.
Oh, okay.